The dust of Jerusalem was the bitter residue of a glory consumed by fire, turning the city into a cemetery of charred stones for decades. Nehemiah lived in the sterile luxury of the Susa palace, where his life was defined by the security of Persian rugs and the king's wine, far from the pain of his people. But news of the collapse crossed the desert, destroying his immediate peace with a spiritual nausea that no banquet could cure. The man who had everything woke up in a nightmare, beginning a reconstruction that started with tears staining the royal marble. This is the Bible teaches. Nehemiah walked through the courtyards of Susa, feeling the weight of the air rising from the hanging gardens. But the fragrance of the acacias now brought him only the acrid scent of smoke from a fire that had occurred over a century ago in his ancestral land. The silence of the palace, once a refuge of privilege and order, became a sonic prison where every step on the marble echoed the humiliation of a people living in ruins 1,000 kilometers away. He felt cold sweat trickling down his back beneath his fine linen tunic, a biological symptom of a soul that no longer belonged to the safety of the Persian court and was beginning to crumble from within before even touching the first fallen stone. The crisis that hit him was not financial or health-related, but a collapse of meaning, the visceral perception that his life was a golden lie built upon the exposed carcass of Jerusalem. The royal cupbearer looked at his own hands, clean and soft from palace service, and felt the taste of ashes in his mouth as he imagined the roughness of the debris his brothers were trying to clear, without hope or direction. Nehemiah's emotional intelligence began to be forged in the decision not to hide his pain behind the mask of convenience, allowing sadness to shape his face before King Artaxerxes himself. He knew that appearing sad before the monarch was a death risk, but the urgency of reconstruction was greater than the fear of the spear, creating a silent tension that made the oxygen in the throne room seem to carry the weight of iron. When questioned by the king, he did not offer a didactic explanation or an empty lament, but a response that joined the vulnerability of a son weeping for his parents' graves with the precision of a manager who had already calculated the cost of his dream in the silence of the night. Biblical psychology reveals to us here that a new beginning is not born from the denial of disaster, but from the courage to look into the open cracks and admit that the old balance is broken forever. He saw the glint of royal gold and the inquisitive gaze of Artaxerxes, feeling that this was the moment for a spiritual autopsy of his own courage, where no would mean the end of a nation, and yes would be the beginning of a calvary of dust and resistance. Nehemiah was not an architecture specialist, but his connection to the pain of Jerusalem made him the only one capable of seeing a city where others saw only a cemetery of fire-scorched stones. He was learning that crisis management begins with a silent prayer between one sip of wine and the next, a fraction of a second where eternity invades chronological time to give orders to a heart willing to be ground by reality. His skin, still preserved by luxury, began to long for the burn of the desert sun and the salt that would dry on his face during the nights of vigil he could not yet imagine, but which were already written in the trembling of his hands. The 1,000-kilometer journey across the desert was the period when Nehemiah's skin finally met the reality of his mission, transforming the court official into a man baptized by the dust and salt of vigil nights under an implacable sky. He smelled the camel hair and felt the dry heat that seemed to suck the moisture from his bones, realizing that every kilometer advanced was a layer of Susa peeling away from his soul to make room for the roughness of Judea. When the ruins of Jerusalem finally appeared on the horizon, like a gray carcass under the pale light of the moon, he did not seek the acclaim of local leaders nor call a festive assembly, but preferred the silence of a solitary inspection. He mounted his animal and rode among the rubble during the hours the world slept, hearing only the crack of stones under hooves and the howl of the wind passing through the cracks of the destroyed walls, feeling that the debris was a mirror of the desolation dwelling in the hearts of his people. The psychology of crisis management teaches us here that before lifting the first stone, a leader must have the courage to touch the depth of the disaster without filters, feeling the weight of what was lost to understand the magnitude of what needs to be rebuilt. David, in his time, also knew the desert, but Nehemiah faced a different kind of aridity, the apathy of those who had grown accustomed to living in the emotional trash of defeat. He observed the doors scorched by fire, feeling the texture of charcoal beneath his fingertips and the scent of a past that refused to scar over, understanding that the true barrier to reconstruction was not a lack of material, but the chronic fatigue of those who no longer believe life can be different. His hands, which once held fine wine cups, now felt the irregularities of broken limestone, mapping in the dark the anatomy of a collapse that had lasted more than 100 years. He did not allow himself the luxury of despair, but converted his spiritual nausea into a microscopic strategy, realizing that long-range vision is only useful if accompanied by the willingness to carry the weight of immediate debris. His emotional intelligence revealed itself in information control, keeping his plans secret until his own conviction was solid enough to withstand the impact of the mockery he knew would come from the outside. At dawn, with dust ingrained in his eyelashes and the morning cold still vibrating in his tendons, Nehemiah finally called the people to look at what they had spent decades trying to ignore. He did not use empty motivational speeches or political promises, but pointed to the raw and naked reality of the scorched stones, inviting them to stop surviving in the shadows and start building under the sun. He felt the smell of fear and distrust in the air, a metallic odor mixed with the scent of nearby olive trees, and understood that the authority to lead a fresh start from zero does not come from a royal title, but from absolute identification with the pain of those on the ground. The practical application of this moment for your life is brutal. The reconstruction of your personal ruins only begins when you stop looking away from your own divorce, your failure, or your grief, and decide that the debris, though heavy, is the raw material for your future fortress. Nehemiah was not just raising stone walls, he was healing the backbone of a nation that had learned to walk hunched under the weight of shame. The challenge of reconstruction became a war of nerves the moment the sound of pickaxes hitting limestone was drowned out by the laughter of Sanballat and Tobiah, who watched from the hills with the venom of mockery dripping from their mouths. Nehemiah felt the impact of those words as if they were physical stones thrown against his chest, realizing that crisis management requires a skin thicker than the wall itself being built. He saw the sweat mixed with dust on the workers' faces, men who held a tool in one hand and a spear in the other, living in a state of continuous alert where the next breath could be interrupted by the glint of enemy metal. The smell of human sweat and hot iron permeated the air, creating an atmosphere of urgency where rest was a dangerous luxury and vigilance was the only currency that bought survival. Nehemiah's Christian psychology revealed itself in his refusal to come down from the wall, to argue with those who only wanted to see him fail, understanding that absolute focus on the task is the best response against those who try to hijack your peace with empty criticism. The logistics of that fresh start were a chaotic dance between despair and discipline, where entire families worked side by side, protecting their own piece of debris while watching the cracks that still invited invasion. Nehemiah walked among the night fires, feeling the heat of the embers and the tremor of the earth under the patrol's footsteps, acting as the tendon that held together the broken bones of that wounded nation. He was not just coordinating the placement of stones, but performing surgery on the soul of a people who needed to learn to replace the taste of ashes, of defeat, with the roughness of limestone, of the new reality. His hands, now marked by deep calluses and sharp-edged cuts, were the testimony that real leadership is not exercised from above, but from within the trench, where the smell of damp earth and the weight of the burden are shared without distinction of caste or privilege. When exhaustion reached its peak and inner voices began to echo physical fatigue, Nehemiah changed strategy, positioning guards in the most vulnerable places and reminding everyone that they were not fighting just for walls, but for their homes, their children, and their identity. He felt the vibration of the trumpets meant to warn of an attack, a percussive noise that kept the city's heart rate in constant tension, forcing every man to face his own mortality with every brick laid. Emotional intelligence here is the recognition that the crisis does not end when work begins, but intensifies at the moment your change begins to bother those who profit from your ruins. He watched the shadows of the watchtowers lengthen over the Kidron Valley, a man who discovered that true security does not come from the absence of enemies, but from the unshakable presence of a purpose greater than the fear of annihilation. Internal tension in Jerusalem reached a boiling point when hunger began to compete with fear, revealing that the greatest threat to reconstruction did not come from foreign swords, but from the injustice corroding relations among the survivors themselves. Nehemiah felt the smell of despair in the narrow streets, a scent of dust and cold sweat from parents who needed to pledge their lands and even their children's futures to get a handful of wheat while they raised the city walls. He observed the gaunt faces and hollow eyes of the workers, realizing that the social structure was as fragmented as the stones they were trying to set, and that an external wall would be useless if the nation's heart was rotting from within. Nehemiah's Christian psychology manifested in a holy indignation that made him summon the nobles and magistrates for a brutal confrontation in the raw light of day, where he did not use diplomacy, but the cutting truth of one who understands that leadership without integrity is merely a refined form of tyranny. He felt the sun's heat hitting his face and the vibration of his own voice echoing against the new limestone, confronting the greed of those who profited from others' chaos, demanding the debt and oppression be cancelled so the people could breathe again. Nehemiah's crisis management reached a master level when he decided to give up his own privileges as governor, refusing the royal banquet and the heavy tax to sit at the table with the people, sharing the same dry bread and the same burden. He saw the tremor in the usurers' hands as they returned the collateral and felt the change in the atmosphere, where the weight of the iron of injustice was replaced by the lightness of a shared purpose in freedom. His own hands, stained by contact with debris and the constant handling of records, became the seal of a new alliance where the leader is not the one who feeds off the flock, but the one who wears himself out so the flock may flourish. Emotional intelligence here is revealed in the ability to reform a community's emotional economy, understanding that the motivation to start from zero dies if people feel they are building the cage of their own slavery. He observed the work's progress with a microscopic eye, noting that the stones now seemed lighter in the hands of men who had regained the dignity of owning their own land and their own destiny. The heart rate of the reconstruction accelerated when the wall finally closed, but the cracks of betrayal still tried to open through diplomatic invitations hiding assassination intentions. Nehemiah felt the cold night wind bringing Sanballat's messages asking for a meeting in the valley of Ono, a place that smelled of ambush and low-level psychological manipulation. He realized that the narcissist, when unable to stop the work by force, tries to stop the worker through fatigue and false proximity, forcing a dialogue that only serves to sow doubt. Nehemiah's response was the pinnacle of a survivor's energy economy. He did not bother to hate his tormentors, but responded with the clarity of granite, that his focus was too large to be interrupted by small distractions. He remained atop the wall, feeling the roughness of the parapet beneath his palms and the smell of fresh lime mortar. A man who understood that the greatest victory over crisis is maintaining an identity that cannot be bought by false smiles or destroyed by death threats. The completion of the wall in just 52 days was not an engineering event, but the birth of a new era where the silence of defeat was finally buried under the weight of thousands of stones laid with sweat and blood. Nehemiah felt the desert wind whip the faces of the newly erected tower, realizing that the smell of damp lime and the touch of solid limestone were physical proof that the impossible had become the ground beneath his feet. He watched the priests' trembling hands as they consecrated the gates, men who had traded temple comfort for the roughness of the construction site. Understanding that starting from zero requires a baptism of reality, where holiness manifests in the strength of the arm and the persistence of the soul. Nehemiah's Christian psychology teaches us that crisis management reaches its peak when we stop being victims of the ruins and become the architects of our own security, transforming the debris of the past into the unshakable foundation of a new authority. He remained at the highest point of the wall, watching the sun set over the valley, feeling that his true mission was not to close stone cracks, but to heal the fractures of a nation that had forgotten how to walk with its head held high. The mystery of that work did not lie in the speed of construction, but in the chemical change that occurred in the spirit of every man who carried a burden while watching the horizon. A transformation where fear was replaced by a loyalty that Persian gold could never buy. Nehemiah felt the taste of salt on his lips and the weight of his rustic cloak, realizing that his identity as a royal cupbearer had died to make way for the leader who knew the exact cost of every inch of conquered freedom. He saw the sweaty faces of his brothers and felt deep compassion, a microscopic understanding that their pain was his own pain, and that one person's victory was everyone's security against the army of shadows still lurking around the walls. Emotional intelligence is revealed here in maintaining vigilance even after triumph. Understanding that reconstruction is a continuous state of preserving character and integrity in the face of threats that change shape but never purpose. He did not come down from the wall to celebrate with banquets, but remained at the observation post, a man who discovered that the highest throne is the one occupied in silent service to a purpose that survives time. This journey through the reconstruction of Jerusalem is the same spiritual autopsy we need to perform on our own crumbled lives, reminding us that ruins are not the final point, but the beginning of a new divine architecture. If today you walk among the rubble of a divorce, a failure, or a deep loss, know that Nehemiah did not have special resources, but he had the courage not to look away from the disaster until he transformed it into destiny. The desert and the debris were the teachers that shaped the leader Israel needed, proving that your excellence is born the moment you decide your name will not be remembered for the destruction you suffered, but for the wall you had the audacity to rebuild. The silence of the night now brings a peace that surpasses understanding, as Nehemiah observes the glow of torches along the wall, feeling that his soul is finally home, protected not by stones, but by a faith that was proven in fire and came out tempered like steel. Your story of pain has become the script for a healing that now extends to you, inviting you to pick up your first stone and believe that starting over is the only possible direction for those who decided not to die in the shadows. Has this journey brought some relief to the pressure you have been feeling in your current environment? If this script of healing and resilience spoke to your heart, share this video with someone you know is struggling to maintain sanity and rebuild their life amidst chaos. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue these reflections together that bring the Bible into the rawness of our reality, transforming stories of pain into manuals of practical hope and spiritual development. Leave in the comments which lesson from Nehemiah's crisis management most resonated with your pain today. I read each account as a prayer for your personal and professional reconstruction. Always remember that you may be facing ruins now, but your new name and your crown are being forged in the silence of every stone you decide to lay with faith. I am the Bible Teachers, and we'll meet in the next whisper. Rest in the certainty that the peace surpassing all understanding will guard your heart as you finish raising your walls.